Okay, welcome, Forrest. And let me just repeat the introduction I gave a while ago. Forrest Hylton teaches history and politics at the National University of Colombia in Medellin, although he spent many months, I believe, in COVID-induced exile in Brazil. He has an academic background as a historian of modern Latin America, with a broad variety of interests in class, race, ethnicity, regionalism, state formation, mostly in the Andean region of the continent. He's the author of Evil Hour in Colombia, which was published by Verso in 2006, a history of that country over the last 150 years, a political economy of coffee, cattle, and cocaine, for those of you who like alliteration. Forrest writes frequently about South American politics for the London Review of Books website, also for NACLA and several other outlets. And he's a frequent guest on my radio show, Behind the News. And so I'm going to ask him a few questions, then we'll then kick it open for broader discussion. And Forrest, first, thanks for joining us. But first, before we start talking about Colombian domestic politics, could you say a few words about the role that the country has played as a local enforcer for the U.S. over the decades?
So, yeah, Colombia helped to expel Cuba from the Organization of American States in 1962. And Colombian elites, even before the Cuban Revolution, the president of Colombia had met with President Eisenhower and urged him to reorient U.S. military aid towards the fight against, communist guerrillas. So Colombia, when we think about sort of kind of anti-communist politics in the Western Hemisphere and kind of military intervention and the sponsoring of death squads and so forth, Colombia was sort of present from the beginning, going back to the Kennedy years. And so it's fair to say that all through the Cold War, there were no kind of strong nationalist tendencies among any governing elites or the two parties that ruled in conjunction with each other. There was no anti-American nationalism at any point. So the Colombian oligarchy, which has not split since basically the 1940s, has been relatively united since then, has very much been the beneficiary of and the promoter of the Cold War. And we can understand that in terms of the construction of a counterinsurgent state, which criminalizes vast swaths of the population in the name of fighting communist guerrillas. So that really ramped up in the 21st century with Plan Colombia, which was actually designed under Bill Clinton and not under George W. Bush, and a massive infusion of resources, 80% of which went to the military and the police, meant that Colombia became this sort of gendarme state in the first decade of the 21st century, at precisely the time when, Lula had come to power in Brazil and was in power for the period when the United States was ramping up this counterinsurgency war in Colombia. So, that was a time where almost no country was willing to play that role other than Colombia. So it's a long history of very close collaboration at the level of intelligence services, the army, to a lesser degree, the police forces, and that means really significant sort of US aid for the beefing up the repressive capacity of the Colombian state. And the 21st century was like Colombia's great leap forward in terms of expanding its repressive capacity with the United States. The other piece is that the Colombian government signed a peace accord with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia in 2016, which in theory should have brought more peace to the country, but in actual fact, the kind of assassination of social movement leaders in the countryside particularly has only accelerated. So kind of the Cold War never ended in Colombia, and even though a peace accord has been signed, peace has yet to materialize. And most recently in the uprising that we saw in the past couple of months, we could see that the machinery of state repression, but most especially the police forces, were unleashed against unarmed civilian demonstrators who were protesting against and questioning the whole neoliberal model. And as far as I know, the U.S. government response was basically, we trust in our partner, in the Colombian government, and we trust what they tell us, and we trust that they're doing what they can to look after human rights and so forth. So anyway, that's a way to try to tie the history to the present.
And you've often written, I was rereading some of your stuff this afternoon to prepare for this, and you've several times you've said that Colombia is one of the most conservative countries in South America. What is it that makes it that way? How has the right managed to maintain its dominance? Is there something about the class or ethnic structure that makes it particularly conservative? What's the secret?
So, okay, in El Salvador, in Central America, actually, Rob, is a great analogy. Guatemala is where you can look at and see real parallels and comparisons. But if we take El Salvador, right, the guerrillas there were able to successfully represent the nation on some level politically, and they negotiated a peace which didn't question the economic model, but nevertheless, then the FMLN came back to power through elections, right? And I use this illustration because Colombia is really the opposite insofar as the guerrillas in Colombia, which existed for like 50 or 60 years, never represented the nation. They never were anything but a regional power at most. And so sort of the lack of a national kind of capability of the guerrilla opposition is what allowed, in part, the Colombian oligarchy, which, like I said, has been largely united since, let's say, the 1950s, the perceived communist threat, which, though the threat was always overhyped and exaggerated in order to justify the massive buildup of repression and then sort of unleash both the military and paramilitary forces against civilians. Nevertheless, the FARC did in fact surround Bogota pretty much. And middle class people and upper middle class people couldn't go to the countryside to their second homes for fear of being kidnapped. And so I think one of the things that explains Colombia's conservative nature is, ironically, the long duration of its basically rural armed insurgency. So the oligarchy, which was united, was able to bring a large percentage of the urban middle class on board for this project of sort of massive buildup of state capacity for counterinsurgency, with the idea that rather than negotiate peace with the guerrillas, what you had to do was cripple them, sort of militarily. But in fact, the guerrillas had been crippled long ago politically, and that's what really matters. So in terms of explaining how Colombia got to be so conservative, it's not that it was a liberal country before that, but there were strong liberal tendencies and there were liberal periods in Colombian history, which were then followed by very conservative periods and really strong reaction against any type of popular mobilization. So, but let's qualify that by saying after the major student strike in 2018, the national general strike in 2019, and then what really was an insurrection a couple months ago, that really appears to have changed insofar as public opinion was massively in favor of the demonstrators for most of the strike, which lasted for insurrection, which lasted for 2 months. So I think there is a sea change that's been going on in Colombia, somewhat below the radar because there isn't official political representation or expression for it yet. But there's a generation of Colombians that does not accept kind of endless austerity and privatization and neoliberalism and this kind of increasing repression in a situation that theoretically, the country's at peace, but it still looks like it's at war. There's a generation that's not willing to accept that as its future or as somehow inevitable, and they see that really as no future at all. And that's what they've said sort of in their own words, right? And they've also said, listen, we know what they're capable of and that they're going to unleash all the repression that they can against us. And that's not enough to send us, back to our dwellings.
I want to get back to this insurgency issue, but first, could you talk a bit about the class and ethnic structure of the population?
Yeah, so there is something that's really important in contrast to Bolivia, where I am right now, or Brazil, where both the question of indigenous in Bolivia and African descended population in Brazil is really paramount, even though Colombia has a significant Afro-Colombian population, particularly on the Pacific coast, and they were certainly active in the latest insurrection. Colombia's sort of ethnicity has not been a major issue in Colombian politics. It's not been a major sort of fault line / division within Colombian politics. And that means that we haven't seen sort of very often ethnic mobilization. And so now there's an important indigenous movement, but it's quite small. And the Afro-Colombian movement is important, but it's quite regionally circumscribed along the Pacific coast. So while you have these movements in Colombia, nevertheless, the majority of the population in the country identifies itself as mestizo, and sort of Colombian nationalism has been built, official Colombian nationalism has been built on the idea that, we're all descended from a combination of European, African, and indigenous, and we should celebrate that fact, and everybody's to be included as long as they sort of accept the mixed nature of the nation. And that was modified somewhat in the 1991 Constitution, but bottom line is that it's never, ethnicity and race hasn't made for sort of national level mobilization in Colombia. And what you have in terms of the class structure is a pretty weak central state, and then deeply entrenched regional elites, many of which have ties to the land, meaning they're large landowners in many cases. And they don't depend on that exclusively, because they're also involved in trade and commerce, oftentimes money lending, credit and debt. So these regional elites tend to diversify their kind of activities in terms of where their capital comes from. And they tend to protect their interests as much as possible through participation in politics. And so you have regional elites that are incredibly entrenched, and to some degree, the central government just kind of depends on these kind of shifting coalitions of regional elites. Is everybody able to hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Okay. So in terms of the class structure, the lack of a strong central government or central state, the lack of any kind of agrarian reform in Colombian history means that the power of these kind of regional oligarchies has never been challenged. And there have been kind of newer elements connected mostly with drug trafficking, but there's also been a fusion of some of the kind of newer elements connected to both drug trafficking and sort of paramilitarism, with maybe some of the older oligarchic families that have long been predominant. But landlordism is a big part of Colombia's class structure in the countryside. And a lot of the wealthiest landlords have diversified investment portfolios. And in fact, plenty of them sort of live in Colombia's major urban centers and conduct their business dealings there. So there's a lot of absentee landlordism, obviously.
Now, what about the drug trade? What's its relation to straight business interests and also to political power?
I would say that the drug trade, to some degree, certainly in many regions, kind of revitalized some of the older landed elites and commercial elites in what might have been somewhat backward or peripheral regions. So ultimately, drug trafficking has pretty strongly strengthened the right because it was the material basis of the paramilitary armies, which, their main job was to massacre civilians, right? The sort of death squad model, whereby the military looks to decrease its participation in human rights violations, and the paramilitaries increase their participation in human rights violations, and the bloodshed and the slaughter continues. So the drug trade was the principal basis of paramilitarism, and the drug trade, paramilitarism spilled over into the cities as well. And it no longer officially exists because the big paramilitary umbrella organization was officially disbanded in the 2000s. But numerous paramilitary structures more or less remain intact. And so the city of Medellín, where I was living in Colombia and teaching, was essentially parceled out among different factions of organized crime which control the city. And Medellín is really the sort of, if not the birthplace, certainly the stronghold of drug trafficking, but where drug trafficking meets illicit enterprise. That's really Medellín's strength, is the combining of the illicit drug economy with illicit economy in construction, services, real estate, insurance, and so forth. So the drug trade has been pretty essential both to rural politics and fortunes, as well as urban politics and urban fortunes.
And how hard has COVID hit the country?
So Colombia's COVID numbers, as recently as a couple months ago, were worse than Brazil's. So COVID has hit the country very hard. Now, I think the overall totals are probably not equivalent to Brazil's in relative terms, but at different points, they have been even worse for brief stretches of time. So there is no, unlike Brazil, there's no public health care in Colombia. It's a privatized health system along the US lines, and it's one in which the quality of service is really poor. And in the case of my professors' union, we have healthcare that used to be pretty decent, but because of neoliberal restructuring of the private healthcare organization, the quality is really, really poor. And public university professors in Colombia are among the more privileged of sort of salaried employees in that respect. So, you go down the ladder. I forget whether it was the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development or whether it was the World Bank, but some organization dedicated to studying inequality and the number of generations that it takes to get out of poverty took a look at Colombia and found that, it was like at the bottom of the list. I think more than Brazil. Like in Brazil, would take in theory like 11 generations to get out of poverty, and in Colombia it was like 13. So Colombian inequality is also even worse than Brazilian inequality, which is difficult to imagine. And I would say that the sheer criminality of elites is also even greater than in Brazil. In Brazil, you have the Bolsonaro clan, and you have some people based in Rio who are up to their necks in organized crime. But it would be hard to say that that's a national phenomenon, whereas in Colombia, as I was saying, the kind of regional oligarchies, both old and new, are very much involved in different forms of organized crime.
Okay, and you touched on this earlier, but let's develop it now. We've seen over the last couple of years an upsurge of demonstrations and strikes, protests. What has been sparking them? Who's behind it, and what's the importance of it?
So I think it's really significant in terms of, in some ways, right? Chile is also quite significant. and the two countries right now within South America, these are the two countries which have had really major insurrections. And in Chile, they're headed towards a constitutional assembly, but Colombia had a constitutional assembly in 1991, and there are a number of sort of provisions in the 1991 Constitution calling for the rule of law and what they call sort of a social welfare state and the rule of law. Obviously, right after the 1991 Constitution was ratified, a series of neoliberal reforms went into effect in 1992, and it's been kind of downhill ever since. So, I mean, Colombian neoliberalism has been overwhelmingly predominant since the restructuring began in the early 90s. I think more than half of Colombia's population works in the informal sector, right? As I mentioned before, the Gini coefficient measuring inequality is really dramatic. So there's a range of sort of long-term causes which have to do with the poverty and the precarity, not only of Colombia's working class majority, but also of a fairly significant middle class, which is maybe about 30% of the population. So a significant portion of this middle class has been, if not impoverished, at least kind of pushed really to the edge of the class. And in the universities, because student strikes really got the ball rolling in terms of protesting against the current government of Iván Duque. In the public universities, there's a lot of students who come from that sort of precarious middle class, and then there's a lot of students who come from impoverished working class backgrounds. And, they've obviously worked really hard to be able to go to top public universities, even though there's not much in the way of jobs waiting for them. But the neoliberal reforms in education sort of massified higher education to an increasing degree, so that there's more and more people studying for college degrees, and yet the conditions under which they're studying have been deteriorating. And I think the straw that broke the camel's back was the government proposal in 2018, essentially to starve the public universities of resources. So students in 2018 went out on strike, and they were out on strike for 3 months. Leaders of the student movement received death threats constantly, and yet the students were able really to win, if you like, the battle for hearts and minds of the majority of Colombian citizens. They really were able to influence the media narratives in ways the media never intended, and were able to strike a really strong chord of sympathy in the broader population, for whom the university is the one place where their kids might be able to sort of get ahead without having to participate in organized crime, in order to do so. So students went out on strike. They were out on strike for 3 months. They won a whole bunch of demands, mostly including greater financing for public higher education across the board. And then in 2019, the government essentially refused to implement these accords. And so in 2019, the students helped to detonate a nationwide general strike, and nothing of that size or scope had happened in Colombia arguably since 1977. And so there were, in addition to the accords that were not implemented with students, there was another series of accords with the peasants who had waged agrarian strikes in years previous. There were accords that the Colombian government had signed with the indigenous population, accords that they had signed with the former FARC rebels. So there was essentially a range of agreements and documents that the government had signed and yet refused to implement. So the National General Strike of 2019 was aimed at getting the government to implement the different accords that it had signed with different sectors, but also kind of challenging the continuation of the neoliberal model. And then came the pandemic. and strikes and mobilizations were planned for March 2020. Obviously, that had to be scrapped, and throughout the pandemic, social movement leaders, especially in the countryside, were continued to be murdered. The police committed all kinds of abuses, and organized crime was kind of running rampant. And this time in 2020, students were certainly involved and they were on the front lines. But what makes 2021 so important in terms of mobilization was that the vast majority of young people who can't go to college and can't even dream of going to college and probably can't even finish high school, who live in the sort of peripheral urban regions, and that's the future of the Colombian working class, they were manning the barricades, and they were confronting the police who were shooting at them and invading their neighborhoods and so forth. And what brought everybody out in 2021 was a regressive tax package, which is no surprise, right? I mean, tax riots have a long history in sort of anti-capitalist struggle and continue today. So the uprising in 2021 that happened a couple months ago was detonated by this regressive tax package. But that was sort of rescinded almost immediately. And as so often happens in these processes, the demonstrators continued to face off against state repression, and their demands kind of proliferated and escalated. So, mostly what the young people of the urban periphery were demanding was local, regional, and if possible, central government investment in jobs, education, transportation, and housing, right? So, and it's important to note that Gustavo Petro, an opposition senator for a coalition called Colombia Humana, he won 42% of the vote in the 2018 elections. And although a far right-wing candidate, took the reins, Iván Duque, Petro won far more than any left candidate had ever won. Petro is a demobilized guerrilla. He demobilized in 1990 in order to participate in the constitutional process. And he has been opposing both kind of militarism, paramilitarism, and neoliberalism ever since. So he has a pretty impressive track record of opposition within Colombian politics. He has survived and is very well poised in the polls ahead of the 2022 elections. So the move of the Colombian sort of state and regional oligarchies was to say, oh, this uprising has been this is all playing into the hands of Gustavo Petro, and Gustavo Petro and his people are orchestrating all of this. And in fact, Gustavo Petro said fairly early on, that the kind of informal proletariat of the urban peripheries should lift the blockades, right, and should avoid, confrontation with repressive state authorities. And that certainly didn't happen, which demonstrated pretty conclusively that Petro was not, in fact, directing any of this. Although I think he may be poised to increase his percentage of the vote. Who knows if he can win or not, but certainly I would think that the latest insurrection would increase his share of the vote, especially because the government absolutely refused to negotiate with protesters or accede to any of the protesters' demands. So in fact, although this most impressive strike and insurrection happened for over 2 months, nothing got resolved, nothing whatsoever. No demands were met, no further accords were signed. And so, there's a real question as to, okay, what comes next? That didn't seem to move them at all. And of course, after an insurrection of that nature, it takes time to regroup, especially if it drags on like that for several months. So my sense now is that the different movements, you asked what sectors were behind it or what have you. And I've really emphasized the role of young people and the movement from university students to the young people of the urban periphery. And those are not mutually exclusive categories. It's just very few young people of the urban periphery go on to college.
All right, that's about all the questions I had. So do we want to throw it open to the audience? Do we have an MC here, or should I do that?
I think that Mia was going to start with community agreements. Mia, do you want to get us started with that?
Sure, we can jump right into that if people are ready. Thank you so much for that great conversation, super informative. Hopefully people have like stormed up a few questions or brainstormed some questions they have or other topics they'd like for us to cover. But just before we do that, to go over how it's going to work. Obviously, it's a smaller group, so we're not anticipating too many issues, but we'll still do a stack system just to make sure that everyone who wants to talk gets to talk. So go ahead. If you have a question, you can just type the word stack in the chat like I'm doing right now. Great. I know some of like the political ed committee people have some questions they want to ask. So I don't know, Carrington, if you want to start with that or if we want to just like mix it all together, either is fine. Cool. And then I'll go ahead and call on you once it's your turn for stack. You can ask your question. Always assume good intentions. We're all here to learn. Again, hopefully that won't be a problem. And if you do ask a question, just to be considerate of time, please do keep it brief. Don't go off on a long anecdote or give a ton of context. Just ask your question. And yeah, so again, thank you so much. And yes, okay, I know Carrington is on stack first, so let me just make sure I covered everything. Awesome. Okay, yeah, so Carrington, do you want to kick it off with the first question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Forrest, for joining us today. And so we're so glad you were able to get through on the internet. My question has to do with the elections in 2022. DSA is the largest socialist organization in the country, in the US. And of course, the US has an outsized role in Colombia. And I'm also involved with the DSA's International Committee, and just wondering what you think would be the best way for Americans, particularly socialist Americans, to lend support as the elections approach, given that elections don't always go so non-corruptly.
Yeah, particularly in this case, the 2022 Colombian elections, there are so many ways in Colombia to either pay people to vote a certain way, to threaten them to vote a certain way, to seduce them into voting a certain way through T-shirts and baseball hats, and then there's actual, real fraud. So ahead of the 2022 elections, we can assume that they will do everything to demonize Gustavo Petro. He's worse than Chavez. He's worse than Fidel. I mean, that's going to be the line, because in 2018, the line was, he's Castro Chavista, this guy, Petro. And if he wins, it's going to be another Venezuela. Meanwhile, like, Venezuela doesn't have 80,000 disappeared people in its history. So, that it's going to go along the exact same track. And this is sort of international at this point, like between like Steve Bannon, the sons of the president in Brazil, the regime in Colombia. These people triangulate and communicate, and they sort of message, in similar ways. So that was the tack in 2018. It's unlikely to be a whole lot different in 2022. And so I think that it's important to keep track of the money that's going through the National Endowment for Democracy for, whoever the candidate is going to be opposing Gustavo Petro, to try to keep track of any disinformation campaigns that the US might be, sponsoring, although it's pretty hard to tell that that's what they're doing until after the fact. But I think also emphasizing the that the military and the police are pretty clearly criminal, and that the United States really, ought to be supporting peace, meaning they shouldn't be spending these kinds of resources on beefing up what are already these really sort of bloated and violent kind of military, paramilitary configurations. So I think that's the main thing, is to try to insist that U.S. policy towards Colombia shouldn't be so exclusively focused on the sort of the military and the police, and that the elections, the less U.S. meddling there is, the better. I mean, I think that has to be the message essentially. But we've seen obviously what they do in elections in Bolivia, and this is kind of the new mode, is to claim that the elections were somehow fraudulent if the wrong person wins, or so on and so forth. So probably be alert for that possibility too. I mean, Petro could win and they could say, oh no, this is fraudulent, so anyway, I hope that is helpful.
Awesome, thank you. And I had myself on stack, but I'm still I do have a question, I'm still formulating it. So I will put myself a little bit lower down on the stack and pass it off to Steve.
I too would like to pass mine off to Ara, if I may.
Sure. Thanks, Forrest. Really appreciate you making the time and sharing your knowledge with us. I was wondering, earlier you mentioned that the Colombian oligarchy has essentially been like a united front since the 50s. Could you say more about the history of the oligarchy and like how it first actually came to be united and how that came about?
Sure. I'll say, so, I mean, it's an unbelievable story, because Colombian oligarchs sort of unleashed civil wars, which were really common in the 19th century and throughout Latin America, as different elites jockeyed for control of the central government and sort of the future of the state, and also the money, kind of coming from exports. They engaged frequently in civil wars. In Colombia, there was one of these civil wars between like the two major political parties that were formed in the mid-19th century from 1946 to 1957, and 200,000 people died, and like 80% of them were peasant males, the vast majority of whom were illiterate, and like an awful lot of them were slaughtered with machetes, not with any kind of real weaponry. So this was just like a slaughter of basically biblical proportions given Colombia's size at the time. And it had to do to some degree with Colombia's coffee economy and the jockeying of people who were at the bottom of that economy to kind of maintain control of what little land they had access to and not lose land had become dispossessed, and they were willing to slaughter their neighbors in order to ensure that that didn't happen as the two political parties went to war, and the kind of people at the bottom of the coffee economy in both parties were mobilized on behalf of these parties. So this is a kind of conflict where it's like, wait, what was at stake ideologically here? I mean, not very much. What were the differences? They weren't all that significant. And so this had also happened at the end of the 19th century, where 100,000 people died in Colombia's other major civil war. And it had everything to do with kind of how the Colombian export economy was going to evolve. The conservatives in the late 19th century were very much against the kind of free trade, open export economy that the liberal elite wanted. And even though the conservatives won that civil war, they eventually implemented a kind of coffee export economy and were in control for 20 years. The liberals came back to power briefly, and their brief stint in power provoked this civil war in the mid-20th century that cost 200,000 lives. So, they were they were different cross-class coalitions of kind of interests. There wasn't that much at stake in terms of ideology, at least after the 19th century. And so you can see where, okay, you have this oligarchy that either mobilizes the population in these really bloody civil wars when it's not united, or is able to unite and close ranks against like any kind of independent left. And then you see why a kind of rural guerrilla would arise saying, listen, you know, there are no kind of legal paths to doing politics in the countryside. Armed struggle is the only way. We've tried these other things and we've just been slaughtered as a result. So that's a little bit about how Colombian politics maybe came to be so polarized in terms of a closed oligarchic system and then a left alternative that really emphasizes armed struggle as the be-all, end-all of radical politics. And that lasted right through the 1980s and arguably into even the 1990s, which is the decade when the Colombian guerrillas expanded most rapidly, right? The 1990s, when everybody else is demobilized or kind of the guerrilla phase of things is over, in Colombia, it accelerated. And then that's where the military and the paramilitary reaction came in. And, you know, the militaries and the paramilitaries without US help would have been really hard pressed kind of to break the FARC. And so, you know, the oligarchy was totally united about the fact that, yeah, let's like get the US in here, like let's get some US military bases in here. There was no opposition from any fraction of the Colombian oligarchy to the idea of having US military bases all over the place.
Awesome, thank you. And next we have Charles.
Thank you. Can you say something about how, I'm using words I don't fully understand, civil society and formal politics works? Are there political parties with members? Do they meet? What kind of regular politics exists that's safe and legal, but also left-wing or even progressive?
Well, that would be in a different country. Because Colombia is the most dangerous place for any trade unionist. I mean, I was just reading in a PhD thesis, sort of the number of public school teachers who were murdered in the region where I was living and working in Colombia in a relatively short span of time. And it's frankly astonishing. And so anybody who's involved in trade union activities, community organizations, even nonprofits, human rights NGOs, journalists, these people are constantly threatened with death and then oftentimes murdered. But that's why the Gustavo Petro's coalition, which is called Colombia Humana, is so important, because even though it's not really a permanent party structure in any sense, it's to some degree sort of his political vehicle, it nevertheless, at election time, it represents a coalition of pretty much every progressive tendency in the country. I don't think there are any progressive sectors that I'm aware of in Colombia who didn't want to vote for Gustavo Petro or thought there was some reason not to vote for Gustavo Petro. So at the same time, sort of permanent national level political party structures don't exist because I didn't mention this piece and I should have, a political party founded by the FARC rebels in the mid 1980s had been physically eliminated by the early 1990s, which is to say, I think like 3,000 or 3,500 of its militants were murdered extrajudicially, right? So in previous efforts to establish left political parties, people have had to confront overwhelming state and parastate repression. And that actually does speak to the system. Your question was about the Colombian political system, and it's a system that simply didn't allow for that kind of initiative. And it was tried at different periods. People did try to kind of bring together some sort of urban left. Another thing to mention is that Gustavo Petro has been mayor of Bogota, which is Colombia's largest city by far. It has the third worst traffic problems in the world. behind Moscow and Beijing. It is a total disaster and completely ungovernable. And he did a reasonably decent job, despite what the media says, and despite the fact that they tried to drive him out of politics as a result. So unfortunately, in Latin America, I mean, even a solid party structure like the Workers' Party, I've been living in Brazil and am headed back there shortly. I mean, it's all completely dependent on Lula, right? And much stronger than the PT itself is the figure of Lula as this individual kind of leader, savior. So, here in Bolivia, Evo Morales and his political party, and even now with Evo Morales' political party back in power and Evo Morales not in the presidency, the shadow of Evo Morales looms so large over anything that the current president might do that, that's actually a sign of organizational weakness. And so I think in Colombia, there's some of that with the kind of indispensable figure of Gustavo Petro. But at the same time, and this is perhaps, potentially dangerous, a lot of protesters are saying, nobody represents us. We represent ourselves. And this quickly can turn into sort of anti-politics, were it not for the sort of broadly social democratic agenda that the protesters are insisting on. I mean, protests are talking about they want good healthcare and they don't want to pay for it. They want good education and they don't want to pay for it. They want investment in jobs programs and so forth, and they're demanding that the government provide this. So I think that's sort of the silver lining of the fact that a lot of demonstrators feel like they don't have any political representation in the official sphere at the national level. But there were also videos that protesters made, and young people, again, I mean, these are like hip hop videos, that end with the MCs saying like, listen, like, as a message to the government, you people think that we don't vote. You think we're stupid. You think we don't vote. Like, we vote, and like, keep it in mind. So I think that bodes well for Petro and his chances in 2022. But my sense is that maybe Colombia is a little like Venezuela in that Hugo Chavez didn't have a solid kind of political party structure when he came to power. And once he was in power, he did build one, for all the limitations of Chavez's political vehicle. Being in state power allowed him to advance in that direction. And who knows, perhaps if Petro won the elections, he would find a way to establish some more kind of solid and permanent political vehicle. But again, the Colombian context until most recently has been one in which, the militants and the leaders of these parties are murdered. And I just want to give one quick anecdotal example that happened almost exactly a year ago. A colleague I know, he doesn't work at my university, but he worked across the river from me. He was the regional representative of Petro's coalition, and he was murdered. He was stabbed to death in his apartment about a year ago, and he had been denouncing some of the mega projects that the regional oligarchy was involved in. And my suspicion is that was sort of his unpardonable crime, but he was also the regional leader for Gustavo Petro's coalition and a sort of outspoken professor, and professors in public universities in Colombia tend to be active in unions. So he was also a trade unionist. And Colombia, it's worth adding, is consistently the country where the majority of trade unionists murdered in the world come from. There's always between 50 and 60% of trade unionists murdered in any year are murdered in Colombia.
All righty, and we have time for a couple more questions, so I will pass it off to Melissa.
Hi, Forrest. Thank you so much for this space. Yes, my name is Melissa. I'm actually Colombian, but I've been living most of my life in Canada. So it's been really interesting following everything from afar. And it's my first time really paying very close attention to Colombian politics. And you brought up the whole media situation in Colombia, how they demonize Petro. And my question is, do you think it is going to work this time? And I guess my question is a two-part question. Is my understanding is Iván Duque is extremely unpopular right now. What does that also mean for the oligarchy and sort of the candidate that they're going to push forward?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the way I understand this is that there's a cycle that begins really when Álvaro Uribe comes to power in 2002, and he's the president from 2002 to 2010. That's when state kind of sponsored counterinsurgency kind of ramps up to really high levels, and the U.S. is deeply involved. And Uribe rode pretty high through the Bush years and through the Obama years, despite the fact that something like 10,000 civilians were disappeared by the Colombian army when Uribe was president in order to boost the body count and make it seem like they were making rapid advances against the guerrillas. So Uribe got away with all of this scot-free, impunity, total impunity. And yet, then he became senator, and he helped sort of undermine the peace process to some degree, kind of fatally undermine the peace process with the FARC rebels, and then put his own candidate back in power, because Iván Duque is only in the presidency because Álvaro Uribe, the president from 2002 to 2010, said that that's who should be the president. But the far right is really has been completely delegitimized, as you said. So Iván Duque has like a popularity of like 16%. I'm not sure what it is now, but at one point, pretty recently, it was as low as 16%. And the demonstrators and the protesters still retained a support of like greater than 2/3, right? And this is after the strike has gone on and on and on. So the far right has essentially kind of used up all its ammo, as far as I can tell. Now, Uribe has been counted out before and somehow staged a comeback. But right now, one of Uribe's sons is sort of positioned to be the candidate for the far right. And that's just a joke. Like, even with Uribe behind him, no, he doesn't have a chance. And Uribe's popularity levels have also fallen dramatically. And Uribe is from Medellín and from Antioquia, where I was based. And for a long time, that was his stronghold. And it was an impenetrable stronghold, in part because of the strength of organized crime. Not anymore. And the mobilizations in Medellín were as big as they were in other cities, except for Cali, which was really the epicenter of the most recent round of uprising. But the bottom line is the far right really doesn't have anybody anymore. It's not clear that the center or the center right has anybody, because the center and the center right were really delegitimized in this most recent round of protests and uprising. Their sort of disconnection from politics on the ground and the concerns of the majority of working class Colombians, couldn't have been more evident. In fact, their disconnection from urban middle class Colombians couldn't have been more evident. So by the center, I mean mostly the kind of Green Party, and the mayor of Bogota. She's a PhD in political science from Northwestern. She's the first openly sort of gay mayor like that I'm aware of in any major city in Colombia. And so she, at the same time, has been incredibly repressive in the most recent round of protests, and just completely delegitimized. Like, her political career is pretty much over, I would say. And the center-right candidate for the Green Party, Sergio Fajardo, former mayor of Medellín, he's running at like 15% right now or something like that. And it's very hard to see him getting more than 20% of the vote. So the center is not that strong or that impressive either. And that leaves Gustavo Petro on the left, and he is by far the strongest candidate for now. So what are they going to try to do in the meantime? They've already tried lawfare, right, which worked against Lula to some degree. It resulted in Lula becoming a political prisoner. They may try to, sort of keep Petro from participating somehow, invent something to try to, bring him down. But they've already tried that, and it failed. And they tried it pretty recently. So it's not clear how many tricks they've got left up their sleeve. And as I mentioned at the beginning of my response to your question, I think a historic cycle that started around 2002 has ended with this most recent uprising. And I don't think there's any easy way back to the old kind of repressive neoliberal governance with the cooperation of the center and the center right, because the center and the center right have just been totally delegitimized through their collaboration with a totally discredited far right. So, and it's worth mentioning that while paramilitary forces in the countryside still assassinate movement leaders and activists in Petro's coalition, paramilitary forces are a shadow of what they once were when, like, Alvaro Uribe became president in 2002. So even though they do represent a threat to the physical integrity of leaders all throughout the countryside, all over Colombia, they don't have the capacity they once had to operate in cities and to attack and dismantle social movements in the cities. And so that's to some degree a sort of hopeful sign. Like, paramilitary forces were minimal, and they were actually para-police forces because it was the police, not the military, who were murdering demonstrators. But those para-police forces were not effective, they were not widespread, and they were not nationwide. It was really closely circumscribed to Cali. So I think that's a hopeful sign in terms of, okay, what are they going to do? Well, what can they still get away with doing? It seems like they have really run out of ammo. And this is why when Doug asked me about, Colombia being such a conservative country, even though there's as yet no institutional way out of this stalemate or no institutional channels to sort of make any kind of reformist breakthrough, I don't think that Colombia remains the conservative country that it has long been. And I think there's a real sea change taking place. And regardless of the fact that the government wouldn't negotiate, wouldn't accede to any demands, I don't think that means that the movement was defeated, or that, it was just kind of something ephemeral and kind of blew up and now it's just going to go away. No, the model itself is in question. The problems are sort of systemic and permanent, and there's no real proposed solutions other than what Petro is offering. And I hope it hasn't sounded that like I'm some huge fan of Petro. I think it's a real problem when individuals become so much more powerful than the kind of organizations and the movements. But it's not really it's more just to say that nothing like this has ever been the case in recent Colombian history. It's this kind of highlight the novelty of the situation, both in terms of the uprising and then an actual viable candidate with a really considerable track record who could translate this into electoral gain. So that's kind of the point of my comments about Petro and where he stands in front of 2022 elections.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I know we are coming up on 8:30, so I will give it one more question if that's okay with you, Forrest. I know we've been basically grilling you for the whole hour, so I'm going to skip over myself and hand it over to Jasenia if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, my name is Yesenia. I'm also Colombian, and my question is a little bit more personal, if that's okay. My grandparents went through la violencia. My cousin was a victim of Uribe's falsos positivos. And my question is, I still have a very large majority of my family that are very hardcore Uribistas. How would you, with the election coming up, I really want to approach them in a way to try to engage them outside of their beliefs of Uribismo? How would you go about trying to engage them and maybe changing their mind? I don't know if that's too personal of a question. I just don't even know where to start with them, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely makes sense. My students we're certainly sort of negotiating this contradiction in some cases, kind of on a daily basis throughout the strike. And so kind of the question is, what's effective pedagogy with family members? And that's obviously a very difficult question. And I mean, I think it's one of those things where it's like, okay, if you had a cousin who was a victim of falsos positivos and that wasn't enough to sort of change their mind, then they might be truly dyed in the wool. But Antioquia and Medellín is a city and region that was absolutely chock full of dyed in the wool Uribistas, and they're still around, but I'd be surprised if they amounted to more than 20% at this point. And so, I mean, I think the thing to emphasize maybe is just like, okay, what are the prospects for education? What are the prospects for people getting decent jobs, living decent lives? And what have been sort of government measures to kind of improve the quality of people's lives? So let's say that your family members consider protesters to be terroristas vandálicos, right? People who are engaging in terrorism through minor property destruction, which mostly involves like spray painting and breaking windows. But nevertheless, right, the effort has been to paint those people as terrorists and vandals, and yet, they have concrete kind of demands that they're making. And so, even if your family members despise the demonstrators, it's like, okay, well, what has the government done to like make the demonstrations go away, other than just like firing on people and like murdering dozens of people? But they might think that Uribe was right to say that it was time for the armed forces and the police to act in order to kind of bring back order to what had become chaos. That was the Uribista narrative. But like I said, it didn't go down with the majority of the population. But I just think the conditions right now, in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of housing, in terms of jobs, and in terms of transportation, these are things that a lot of people recognize are not good, and they're directly affected by it. And so this was what I saw in terms of people really changing kind of their own ideas about kind of politics and the future, in terms of being like, yeah, we're really not getting any of what we need in terms of public goods and services. And so, what these protesters are saying mostly has to do with like, government investment and demanding government investment in things like health and education, rather than sort of military spending or a revamped police budget. So, I mean, that's like what I've observed in my participation in the strikes and demonstrations and so forth, was that the demand for healthcare was what, the fact that students were demanding healthcare as well as education was something that really resonated with people. And then sort of the demand for education and healthcare broadened out, to different demands. But most of them involve public goods and services and, government investment in something other than repression. So it seemed like that really had resonated with a lot of people. And as the repression escalated in this latest round of protests, it seemed to alienate more and more people, at least as measured by public opinion polls, which, are not necessarily that reliable, but they're an indicator of sorts. So, I mean, I think in terms of how to approach it, I think it's really the best thing you can do is discuss the problems that so many Colombians are facing in their everyday lives, in terms of just kind of sheer survival, and how much harder that it's gotten since 2018 for ordinary people to survive and make ends meet. And, from there, maybe discuss the issue of protest and so forth. But it's kind of amazing to me how much sympathy there is now for what I consider to be social democratic demands. I never would have thought it possible. And my students asked me, I think it was in 2019. Yeah, it was in 2019. They were paying very close attention to what was happening in Chile. And they said, hey, do you think anything like this can happen here? And I probably didn't say very much because I probably didn't want to say not in a million years. Like Colombia, no way. There was never Unidad Popular. There was never Salvador Allende. There was never anything like the kind of revolutionary process that took place in Chile in the 60s and early 70s. That's never happened in Colombia, so it's never gonna happen. But had I said that, I would have been wrong. And I'm really kind of shocked at the extent to which a lot of people's ideas about the country, about the politics, about the future have changed and have changed fairly radically. I never would have thought it possible, but it seems to have happened or to be happening.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all of those super thoughtful questions and for the great answers and a really great discussion. I do want people to hang on, and we're going to just make a few announcements. I'll toss it over to Carrington so that you guys can make sure to stay looped in with Night School, because we are starting up with more events soon as the fall comes. So yeah, Carrington, take it away.
Thank you. Forrest, thank you so much. That was just so illuminating. And I like that you ended on that positive note of that you're seeing positive change that you didn't expect to see. I hope that is the case. So thank you everyone for joining us. We'd like to just, if you're not a member of DSA, we encourage you to join. Mia will share the links in the chat. So yes, please join DSA. We have a world to win. We need to fight for the Colombians during their election in 2022. Also, we encourage people in New York City to pay chapter dues. With increased chapter dues, we can do things like start a New York City DSA clubhouse, or building in a central building where we can work out of, which would be really helpful, I think, for our organizing. And it will enable us to do a lot of other things, support good candidates for office, etc. Next Thursday, September 9th, please join us for a socialist skills workshop on how to write an op-ed. Liza Featherstone, Doug's wife, will be presenting that for us. We're so excited for that. And this is a skill all socialists need to have, so please attend. And then finally, Night School Fall 2021 semester starts on September 27th. We'll have more details on that soon. Look for emails in the coming weeks. Finally, contact us at nbk.poly.ed@socialist.nyc with any questions, but also we'd love to have you join us. This doesn't, our political ed doesn't happen out of nowhere. It takes, a bunch of us being involved. We'd love to have local contributions. So please consider joining our organizing. And I think that's it. Thanks everybody again for joining us tonight. And we hope to see you all soon. Have a good night. Solidarity.
Thanks everyone. Bye.